I would like to start off first by giving you a little bit of information about Miss Fuller. She is a descendant of a Creek freedman. She attended Southeast High School and worked on the high school newspaper. Miss Fuller obtained her law degree from Seton Hall University, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And in 2019, and she also holds a master's degree in public policy from New England College. She's the founder of a nonprofit organization called Creek Freedman Initiative, the cornerstone of Black Wall Street Foundation, based here in Oklahoma City. And am I correct, Ms. Fuller, you live in California?
Right, that's
Okay,
correct.
so she lives, but we're not gonna hold that against her. So we are very grateful that she took her time to come and see us. She now works as a consultant, lives in California, works as a consultant, and she is an avid genealogist and writer. And we are very grateful for Ms. Fuller's time today. She has also brought some of her books that you can find as you come in. We have a wonderful gift shop, and they will be selling those in the gift shop. And Ms. Fuller has agreed to stay and autograph some of those if any of you would so choose to write those. So, Ms. Fuller, I am not going to take up any more of your time. And Felicia Vaughn is on our library staff, so should you need anything, just let her know, and we will be happy to accommodate you.
Okay.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Laura. Can we turn down the lights just a little bit? Just part of it, so I could have the screen showing a little bit more. You're not ready to tape, right? So, yeah. Is that okay? Is that too dark back there for you?
Is it too dark?
Okay, I don't want it too dark. Can you guys see me? Okay. I just want you guys to see the screen really well before we get started. And can you hear me? I'm doing a mic check. Can you hear me? Okay. There's refreshments in the back. There's tea and water and cookies. They have sugar and some are sugar-free. So if you have that urge, they have it already set up for you in the back. In the front, when you first came in, there are pamphlets of the presentation. If you didn't get one, you can grab one of those. And I think everybody signed in. There's also a sheet here that has a pedigree chart. You can get one of these to take with you and use it for your own history of your family. And then there's pens, and then I made copies of the Department of Interior information for you guys, so you could take this. So everything up here you can take except for the books and my ancestors' pictures. You can't have those. But you can look at them. And we're going to talk about those too as well. If any time you can't hear me, or if I'm too not loud enough for you guys, let me know. I can adjust that too. Let me see. Hello, is this better?
Yes.
Okay. So I want to make sure my voice projects because I do have a mask on. And thank you so much to the Oklahoma Historical Society for allowing us to be here. The administration of the Oklahoma Historical Society, as well as Laura and all the other staff that have been so supportive in helping us bring this presentation to you today. My name is Ameenah Fuller, and I am the author of Okey Drew. Okey Drew was one of my ancestors, and we're going to talk about him momentarily. But first, I want to let you know that I wrote this book. It took a lot to do. I was encouraged by a genealogist, Kenyatta Brooks. Did I get that right? I hope so, Kenyatta. And Kenyatta came here in 2018, I believe. I was here in Oklahoma when I saw Kenyatta. And Kenyatta was promoting her genealogy book. And I just showed her all of the documents that I had, and she said, "Oh, you have enough to write a book. Why come this isn't in a book? Why are you carrying it around?" So that's when she inspired me to write the book. She told me several times that I should write this book. So I still did not know how I was going to do that. I had to really think it out a lot. I talked to my mom before she passed away on writing this book, and she gave me some ideas as well. So fast forward in 2021, I finished the book, and it was published in 2022. So here we are today discussing Okey Drew. So I'm going to get started by giving you guys a little bit of information about myself. Let's see if I can use this correctly. Okay. Okey Drew, first of all, Okey Drew is about an American history story. And I say American history because this is American history. This is where American history started, right here, pretty much. So this is an American history story of 120 years of denial of citizenship rights in the Muskogee Creek Nation. This is talking about Okey Drew's denial of his citizenship rights 120 years ago. And I want to tell you why I talk about American history instead of just Native American or African American history. American history is yet to be told in its entire true form. And in my opinion, American history does not include all the bells and whistles. And what I mean by that, there's a lot of good and bad and ugly. So we have to understand that. So you will experience some lumps and bumps on the way, but in the end, I think that history will build race relations through reconciliation of the past. That's what I believe. Once you read and understand my story, this part of American history will deeply touch your soul. I believe you will begin to show empathy for your fellow citizens, neighbors, and families. So this is another reason why I felt compelled to write the book, is so we can bring some true American history stories to life. And I know Laura gave you some information about me already, but I'll tell you a little bit more. My name that I was born with was Kelly Holmes. It was not Ameenah Fuller. I changed my name when I was 13. I am a descendant of Creek freedmen, and I was born right here in Oklahoma City. So I am a native of Oklahoma. I did attend Southeast High School, and I worked on the high school newspaper. And at age 17, I worked for the Oklahoma City Urban League and a journalism program, and we produced a bi-monthly newsletter. And I developed a teen television program called Speak Out that was designed for Oklahoma City youth to speak out on issues affecting their lives. While I was still attending high school, I earned a television broadcasting certificate from KOKH TV, Channel 25, and I attended Rose State College to pursue a career in journalism. I later attended Oklahoma State University, and I earned a certificate in journalism program. And I was interested in both journalism and law, so I obtained my law degree in 2019 from Seton Hall University School of Law. And I also obtained a master's in public policy from New England College. I'm currently enrolled in a doctoral program at Alliant International University. So there's been somewhat of a misprint. I'm not a doctor yet. I'm in a doctoral program, so I'm a doctoral candidate. And I have already started because I've written the book Okey Drew, so that is part of my work as a doctoral candidate. In the same year, I founded a nonprofit organization called Creek Freedmen Initiative the cornerstone of Black Wall Street Foundation, and that nonprofit is based here in Oklahoma City. I have a website and lots of information on there. Currently, I live and work in California. I live in Palm Springs. I work as a consultant, and I do devote my spare time to writing and genealogy research. And as I said before, I believe it's history that will bring us together. I think history will mend our hearts and our minds. And it's history that tells the story to follow a path with two directions, right or wrong. History tells you the past so you can choose the right road for the future. And that's what I believe. The items or things that we're going to talk about is so vast. I could only condense it down, and this is the way I condensed it down in an overview. First, who is Okey Drew? And then a history of timeline of how these events occurred. Heritage and land, and the story of Okey Drew and his testimonies. Denial of citizenship rights. Slave masters and benefits. And the breach of the 1866 U.S. Treaty, Bureau of Indian Affairs, the role of the Commission, and no more dreams deferred. So these are the categories that we're going to discuss today. So let's get started, and at the end we'll have a session of questions and answers. So who is Okey Drew? That's the big question. Okey Drew, a.k.a. Calvin Anderson, was my second grand uncle. And that made him my great-grandfather Dick's uncle. He was the brother to Nero Drew, and his sister's name was Rachel. And his father's name was Andy Sales. His mother's name was Vena Drew. And the question is, why and how did he have the name of Okey Drew, if his name was Calvin Anderson? Well, he was relocated as a young boy to Jefferson, Texas, when the Civil War started. And he stayed with a family friend at that point. That's the time he picked up the name Okey, because he was from Oklahoma and he was in Texas. And his last name of Drew was a slave master's last name, which came from Delilah McIntosh Drew. His real name was Calvin Anderson. And after they were no longer enslaved as people, I'm talking about my entire family clan after they were no longer enslaved. They decided to choose a name from their father, Andy Sales. And they chose the name of Anderson. So that's how that last name of Anderson came about. So they didn't want to keep a slave name of Drew. So you'll see on several documents, some places where you'll see Drew, some places you'll see Anderson. But these are my ancestors, and they are Okey Drew's ancestry history. So let's get started on the history part, the timeline of important historical events during enslavement of freedmen and after in the Muskogee Creek Nation. So the first event was within the late 1700s, enslavement of African Americans by Native Americans. Now, Native Americans did enslave African Americans in the 5 civilized tribes, and not every Creek enslaved African Americans, but a lot of Creek Native people enslaved African Americans. And we'll talk about who they are in a minute. But this is important to know. There was also white people who enslaved Native people. There was a lot of enslavement going on. Native people even enslaving some of their own people. That would be some of our people, my people. So we'll talk about that too. The second event, the Creek Nation had a leader. His name was William McIntosh, and he was assassinated because they felt he traded them off to the U.S. government with a particular treaty. In 1825, they assassinated him. So he was no longer, of course, the leader, but he was, in fact, a slave owner. And we'll talk about his role in a minute. The third event, of course, was the Trail of Tears from 1831 to 1850. And that is when they were banished from the South, like Alabama, Georgia area, and they were sent to packing to Oklahoma. That's how they got here. And the fourth event, of course, that happened was the Civil War, the fight over slavery. Because on the Trail of Tears, slaves came with them, came with Native American slave owners. They were with them. They brought their slaves with them. So the fight for slavery included Native Americans and Confederates. They were fighting all to keep slavery now. It wasn't like they were not in that fight. They were very much so in that fight. But you know how that ended. The Civil War ended and slavery ended as well subsequently. And in 1866, post-Civil War, there was a U.S. 1866 peace treaty. So that came after the Civil War. They had to make a peace treaty. That included losing some of their land because they failed to, cooperate with the U.S. government, and they also fought to keep slaves. With that, they were penalized for all of those things, and they were told also, you got to keep your slaves here in your nation, and you have to adopt them as citizens of the tribe. They have to get the same rights that you have. And this was very, very important because the adoption was amenable, it was accepted within this treaty, and the treaty was signed by all parties, the Creek Nation, the Cherokee Nation, and Choctaw Nation. All of these nations signed off on these treaties to accept and adopt their former slaves as citizens. Now, not all Creek descendants or Creek ancestors were just African American slaves. Some of them were mixed blood. And we're going to talk about that too. They were mixed blood, but they still were listed as freedmen. So this is the discrepancy too that we have, that this heritage is not being told accurately. So in 1887, they created a Dawes Act in 1887, and then later they formed a Dawes Commission in 1893. And that is so that they could, separate the allotments of land. They used that a way of accumulating more land for the U.S. government, basically, less land for Native Americans. But within that, they also had to give each freedman 160 acres of land in the Creek Nation. So all of our ancestors that were Creek freedmen had 160 acres of land if they were on that Creek freedman roll. And that's important to know because this is the tie that binds us. It's the heritage, the adoption, and the land, and the treaty, of course. So, Creek freedman land, let's talk about that. The facts is the Creek freedmen received over 1 million acres of land in Oklahoma. All those shaded blue areas are what would have been Creek freedmen land, which of course, as we said, they acquired that by way of the 1866 treaty after they were adopted as citizens. And we already said, of course, each creek freedman owned had 160 acres of land by land allotments. You'll see that later too, the actual document. The commission to the 5 civilized tribes required application for land allotment, and my ancestors received land by land allotments in the Creek Nation. So we're going to go more into the heritage and the land. And for the past 40 years, this is not just myself, but my mom and me, we've been working and we've been struggling to find our way back home. It's been a long, tumultuous journey, and a journey that I hope is coming to an end soon, that I believe is going to come to an end, and a good end at that. But I'm going to take you to the beginning of the story. This story is about my distant but beloved relative, the brother of my second great-grandfather, Nero Drew. Both he and his brother chose the formal name, and Calvin Anderson, to his father, they honored his name by using the last name of Anderson so that they could get rid of the former slave master last name. And of course, with that use of those names, there were always nicknames to follow. Just in Okey Drew's case, he was considered Calvin Anderson, Calvin Drew, Okey Drew. He had various names that they had attached to him, some attachment to him, and because of that, that made some confusion on who he was. It's a lot of information to identify who he was, and we're going to talk about that as well. And I say in my book, and I say this right now, we're all Okey Drew, and you'll find out soon what I mean. Once I finish this presentation, you'll understand this. In 1962, my great aunt Mildred Anderson received a letter describing something called per capita payments. This was the year I was born, and I was literally, by law, born a citizen to the Native American Creek Nation, now often referred to as the Muskogee Creek Nation. At the time, all my relatives were de facto citizens of the Creek Nation because they were descendants of the Creek freedmen, former slaves, and in some cases, kinsmen, of the Creek, based on the 1866 treaty with the United States government. Creek freedmen were to have the same rights as Creek Indians by blood. So the struggle to regain and maintain our heritage and dignity has been real. Every day we live and breathe this fight to save the history of descendants of former slaves who once lived in Creek territory in Oklahoma, near the Verdigris River. This is where my grandmother was born, and then the young town of Beggs, Oklahoma. Her father, my great-grandfather, Dick Anderson, was born free in Creek territory. His father, Nero Drew, was enslaved by a rich Creek woman named Delilah Drew in Creek territory. And his father, Andy Sells, the origin of Calvin Anderson's surname, was enslaved by a man named John Sells. Andy's wife, Vena, or some people say Vena Drew, was also enslaved by Delilah Drew. And Vena's father, Tarter Grayson, was enslaved by Delilah Drew's father, William McIntosh, chief of the Lower Creek Indians until 1825. Chief McIntosh, which they called him the White Warrior, died a violent death, as we talked about earlier, at the hands of his people, and he was viewed as a traitor for signing a series of dishonorable treaties with the whites. But before he died, he bequeathed his slaves to his daughter, Delilah. According to the Muskogee Daily Phoenix newspaper, Delilah Drew not only owned slaves, but she also controlled a toll bridge by way of the Elk Creek that was built well before the Civil War. And her home was on the south side of Elk Creek. The Creek Council granted Delilah permission to use this toll bridge. So she made money off of the toll bridge. She also had slaves as well. And then as I began to dig further for answers to my past, I discovered my great-grandfather Dick's death certificate and learned that he had died in 1957, just 5 years before my birth. Something, though, stood out so significantly about his life that it caught my eye. The fact that Dick Anderson was born a citizen of the Creek Nation. He died a Creek citizen as well. He was placed on the Dalles roll of the 5 civilized tribes as a young man. He was about 18 years old at that time. And he remained a citizen of the Creek Nation for the rest of his life. I was blown away just knowing how significant this was to my family tree, bringing history to life one event at a time. I began to wonder more and more about my ancestors' contribution to Creek society. This was the beginning of my quest for answers about my family's history in an Indian nation that once opened its doors to my family, first as their slaves and later as fellow citizens. Now, one of Dick Anderson's children was my grandmother, which when you came in, you've seen her on the poster there. She's standing next to a tree. Her name was Rosalie Anderson. She was born in 1914 after Oklahoma became a state. And she too was born a Creek citizen. However, ultimately the Creek Nation failed to keep its part of the bargain guaranteed by the 1866 U.S. Treaty. Surprisingly, recently it breached the treaty with the Creek Constitutional Amendment, requiring all Creek citizens to the Creek Indians by blood in order to have citizenship rights. So what this was is that the Creek Nation created a Creek Constitutional Amendment to say that the only way you can get citizenship rights now is by being Creek Indian by blood, and you have to prove that. This is what breached the 1866 treaty right there. This occurred when I was in high school around 1979. With one stroke of a pen, my family was no longer citizens of the Creek Nation. We were erased from Creek history, basically. Article 2 of the United States 1866 treaty with the Creek Nation gave the freedmen the same citizenship rights as Creek citizens by blood. This is where the breach started. My ancestors are still listed on the Dalles roll. This is clear evidence that their descendants remain part of the Creek Nation. My grandmother Rosa died on Christmas Day in 2010. Under U.S. law, she died as a Creek citizen according to the Article 2 of 1866 treaty, despite the fact that the Creek Nation had illegally divested her of that right more than 30 years before. It's so difficult for me to write that kind of story in a book. Can you imagine? It takes a lot. This is very emotional to write these parts in books. So it takes a lot to put it all together because it still feels like history is being distorted by a few stubborn, unruly folks who fail to keep their end of a solemn bargain with the United States government. So I want you guys to think about a few things. How do you use a people, whether Creek blood or without, and then just throw them away? Think about that. Can you imagine if someone just discarded their own baby? We talk about they were adopted citizens. If you adopt, would you throw that baby away? That's the way that feels. How do you think it feels to abandon people who contributed to the growth of the nation with blood, sweat, and tears? And then how do you think it feels to those abandoned and their descendants? So how do you think descendants feel that they've been abandoned when their ancestors were adopted to the Creek Nation? My ancestors were adopted as Creek citizens by the Creek Nation with the stipulation in the 1866 United States Treaty that they were to be treated equally as Creek citizens. Indeed, many of my historical relatives received 160 acres of land per person in the Creek Nation of Oklahoma, like all Creek citizens did well after the Civil War. Land allotments to their children as well. One of my great uncles, Garfield Anderson, is listed as a Creek freedman, and he received land, and he was an infant at that time. Land recipients I have researched included my great-grandfather, Dick Anderson, Nero, the brother of Okey Drew. Each received 160 acres of land. So did each of Nero's children, Lena, Dolly, Pearlie, Letty, Chelsea, Lizzie, Martha, Molly, Dick, Toby, and Rachel. His grandchildren were Kezia Jameson and Nero Jameson at the time, and Nero died as an infant, but they both received land allotments. Nero Jameson was the son of Lizzie Anderson, and his land was passed throughout and distributed to the heirs. That's what happened at that time. Now, my great-grandfather, Dick Anderson's application for homestead allotment was dated July 16, 1903. And it indicated that he received 40 of his 160 acres. The land was in Oklahoma, and the coordinates is listed as southeast 1/4 of northwest 1/4 of sections 216, township 16, range 17, and then they have 40 acres by that. His roll number for Creek freedman is 2203, and the certificate number for this allotment application was 8299, Commission of the 5 Civilized Tribes, Department of the Interior. But on May 24, 1902, which was a year before Dick got his land, Nero Drew received parts of his land, his allotted land, and Nero was the dad of Dick. He was a farmer, and he worked his land. One day, a Creek woman disputed his right to the land, and a court battle was fought to determine land rights between Nero versus Linda Harrison. Number 509, in court filings, Nero was the contestant and Linda Harrison was the contestee, conflicting of many selections. Department of Interior to the 5 Civilized Tribe land contest, number 509. The case was set for trial. So they go to trial, and Nero proves with evidence that he had this land. He had, created a home on this land. And this land was actually trying to be taken by someone, and he already acquired this land. So ultimately what happened was the courts awarded Nero as the contestant with a certificate showing that he is the rightful owner of this land. And they told Linda Harrison, the contestee, that she needed to, go and find her another piece of land. So they recalled hers and canceled her certificate for land and told her that she would have to select a different parcel of land. So the judgment was in favor of Nero, and Nero Drew had won the rights to the land that he had worked and improved. So that is significant because there was a lot of disputed land even at that time. And Nero, obviously, he was a fighter. He wasn't going to let someone just come and take his land. So clearly, as I indicated, Nero was a fighter. He fought for his land and he won. I too am a fighter for justice. That's why I'm writing this story. That's why I'm in front of you telling this story, because I think it's very important. I want you to also think about, how do you distort history that includes people's property and rights in a nation? So how do you distort history that includes people's property and rights in a nation? What makes the Department of the Interior's commission to the 5 civilized tribes so different from now? And what I say, nothing, I suppose, because we're still waiting for justice in the 21st century battle for our existence as Creek freedmen descendants and Creek citizens. That puts us in limbo as a people because we are 2 nations and justice is not bending to the favor of fairness and equality for all. My ancestors as citizens of the Creek Nation provided testimony attesting to their residency and Creek citizenship to the Creek Nation. One instance that I have put here is about Nero Drew. When they asked him on August 16, 1899, which happens to be my mom's birthday, by a gentleman named, I think it's Cravis, R.R. Cravis. The question was to Nero, how did you become a citizen? Nero answered, by adoption. The next question was, how long have you resided in the Creek Nation? Nero said, nearly all my life. They asked him if he had ever been outside the Indian Territory during the last 2 years. Nero said, no, sir. They further questioned his residency and additional questions like, do you own a home of your own in the Creek Nation? Nero replied, yes, sir. They asked if he had actual possession of the land in the allotment application. Nero replied, yes, sir. One thing for sure, we are tied to the land and the Creek Nation, and we are still treated like chattel. We're still treated like chattel, even though we are tied to the land and the Creek Nation, even today. So, the late General William McIntosh, which is Chief William McIntosh, during his lifetime, General McIntosh possessed the following Negro slaves. These were also some of my ancestors: Tarta, Melinda, Venna, Chloe, Nancy, Fanny, Betsy, Toby, and Ellick. And that these Negroes were given to General William McIntosh as slaves. In his last will and testament, he bequeathed them all to his daughter, Delilah McIntosh Drew, now known as Delilah Drew. Needless to say, it's hard to write about my relatives being bought and sold and tossed around like cattle. I wonder how the descendants of the McIntosh or Drew feel today about their ancestors' actions, but the answer seems to be clear. It's probably the reason why we're still fighting for our citizenship rights. Luckily, I'm able to set the record straight and write the story for all to read. After McIntosh left Delilah Drew, the Negro slaves, according to Lewis, the bequest Thomas Grayson obtained possession of them and carried them to the state of Alabama, where he filed suit to try title of the Negro slaves. So they even filed suit to title to Negro slaves at that time. And that were our relatives, my ancestors. And the court of Montgomery County, Alabama, decreed that the slaves were the property of the heirs of Robert Grayson, to wit, Thomas Grayson, Alexander Grayson, and William Grayson. They sold the slaves to John G. Ross of the Cherokee Nation East from whom the memorialist Kendall Lewis purchased them for a valuable consideration and removed them to the Creek Nation where he lives. Kendall Lewis stated that after he removed these Negroes to the Creek Nation West, they were claimed by Delilah McIntosh Drew under the will of her father, William McIntosh. On May 21st, 1832, by decree of the chiefs and the council submitted that said Negro slaves were bequeathed to Delilah McIntosh Drew, the nation may be liable to memorialist Kendall Lewis. The amount was $2,950. Yep, that's right, $2,950 for my ancestors. That's what they paid to go back to Delilah Drew. Now, we talk about creek freedmen rolls, so I wanted to bring some examples of what they look like. This is Tarta Grayson on here, and that's Melinda Grayson. It shows that they were dead. There's no other information on this tribal enrollment here, but I have another one that I want to share with you that shows you, and I'm going to point it out. It shows you Andy Sales, who is both Nero Drew and Calvin Anderson's father. Andy Sales was owned by John Sales here. And the mother is Vena Drew, and they have her listed here, owned by Delilah Drew. So Vena was owned by Delilah, Andy owned by John Sales. Then I have another document here that shows Andy Sales and Vena Drew. They spell her name different ways, but that's the same person, same mother. There's Calvin Anderson, who is Okey Drew, and Rachel Anderson, his sister, as they list him, the sister. Now, Nero is not on here, but Nero is part of Andy and Vena Drew's son. So they lived in, mostly in Tallahassee, as you can see here. So this is what a Creek Freedman roll looks like, an early Creek Freedman roll. And here is a Creek Freedman roll with actually Nero Drew listed as the head of the household, but still in Tallahassee. And under him are all of his children except for Molly. Molly is on a different roll because Molly was older and she had a husband, so she's not on here. But there's Lizzie, Toby, Dick. Dick is my great-grandfather, second great-grandfather Dick. Lena, Rachel, Dolly, Pearlie, Letty, Chauncey, Kezia Jameson, Nero Jameson, and Martha Anderson. These were all under Nero Drew, and as you see, slave of Delilah Drew. And the township was Arkansas at that time. So this is what a real Creek Freedman roll looks like, and this is most of my ancestors on this roll. So I wanted to share that with you guys because some of you may never have seen this before, this document. But this document is available even here in the Oklahoma Historical Society. You can pull up Creek Freedman rolls. This is an actual land allotment for application for allotment. This is Nero Drew's land allotment, but as you can see, Nero is not the only one listed here. There's Dick and Dick Anderson here. It says 160 acres. For the most part, most of them had their 160. Now, they didn't have to get all of their land at one time. They could, Nero, in fact, went several times and took a piece here, took a piece there. It just had to be total 160 acres. So some of their land was not always listed in one spot on one application. But as you can see, Dick's is listed as 160. And so is Lena Anderson. And so is Dolly and Pearlie and Chauncey, and I think that's Letty up there too. But they didn't all get land at the same time. They did have portions that they came back to get. This is just one. I have several of these land allotment applications. I just brought one so you could see what it looked like. And now let's get into what's most interesting about the book is the story of Okey Drew and his testimonies. So Okey Drew, when he came back from Texas, and remember he was there because of the Civil War, when he came back from Texas, he was told by his mother, Vena Drew, to go and apply for citizenship. And these are testimonies that were taken by former enslaved applicants to the Creek Nation petitioning for their rights as Creek freedmen. But perhaps the one that stands out the most, of course, is Okey Drew. That's who we're talking about today, whose non-slave name was Calvin Anderson. Many witnesses testified on his behalf, proving his parents, his residency in the Creek Nation. Even his former slave owner, Delilah Drew, was mentioned as proof of Okey Drew's residency in the Creek Nation. His immediate relatives were all accepted as citizens of the Creek Nation, but he was constantly denied his citizenship rights nonetheless. So Calvin Anderson, aka Okey Drew, was my second great-grand uncle. In his testimony, he speaks of the aforementioned mistreatment that was quite evident and egregious in the denial of his citizenship rights. In one of his statements from the Department of Interior, a commissioner refers to Calvin Anderson as evidently an ignorant man, a very ignorant man, in fact, he said. This was apparently because Calvin, during his examination, claimed to have received annuities through his father as a child and to have been enrolled as a Creek freedman by various agencies, although the commission claimed to have found no evidence of such enrollment. Calvin, aka Okey, then admitted that he did not know what they were or were, but declared that his parents and more remote ancestors were regularly recognized and enrolled as citizens of the Creek Nation, which was true. This last statement was true and provable, but his honesty regarding his lack of direct knowledge about his enrollment and annuities received seems to have counted against him, unfortunately. And just like that, the commission denied his citizenship rights. Now let's see. First, they enslaved a people, denying them education, and then they had the audacity to call him ignorant. This is our government at the most unjust and cruel. Of course, Calvin Anderson, Okey Drew, was ignorant, but not in the negative sense of that term. He was ignorant to the process, but he was not an ignorant man. So these are what the transcripts look like. They come from the Department of Interior. Let's see if I can point that out to you. Department of the Interior of Commissioner to the 5 Civilized Tribes, Muskogee, January 20th, 1906, in the matter of the application for enrollment of Calvin Anderson as a citizen of the Creek Nation. So it goes on to ask questions of a witness, which is Bob McIntosh. They start asking a lot of different questions. I'm not going to go through all of it, but I will point out some of these questions that they ask that are really interesting. And what they had here is, what is his name? They wanted to know what Okey Drew's name was, and he said Okey Drew. Have you ever known him by any other name? He said, no, sir. For years he gave his name as Calvin Anderson. Did you ever hear that? I heard it since he gave it here. So a lot of people only knew him by his nickname. They didn't know him by his real name, which some of you guys today know that a lot of people use nicknames. We don't even know their real names. Later on, we find out, oh, that's your real name. So that's kind of the way it was. And but that shouldn't have held him accountable for other people, using a nickname on him. So he went on to tell his story of the answers about how he knew Calvin Anderson. He said he belonged to Coweta. Coweta is a town that he said Calvin was in, and that's where he knew him from. And he also gets asked other questions, and he asked him the commissioner asked him a specific question. Let me see if I can highlight that. How do you know he was? And he's talking about where he was when he's talking about him being with Delilah. He said, did you know Okey Drew in 66? Yes, sir. Was he here then in the Creek Nation? Yes, sir. Was he living and residing here at the time in the Creek Nation? He was down on Elk Creek. Remember, I told you that's where Delilah was. He was down on Elk Creek with Mrs. Drew at that time. So how do you know he was? He said he saw him there. So that was more evidence that he was here. He was in the Creek Nation at that time. That was that evidence that we're talking about. These are witnesses that they called upon. And I'm going to go on to another question they asked. He goes down here and they asked him, did he ever have any owners except by the name of Drew? No, sir. Did he have any owners by the name of Anderson? No, sir. He says, what was his father's name? Andrew Sales. Is his father living? No, sir. When did he die? Directly after the war. What is his mother's name? Benna Drew. When did she die? Directly after the war. Do you know if either one of them were living in the Creek Nation in the year of 1866 or 67? Yes, sir, his mother was. Because his mother was the one that told him to go and apply for citizenship at that time. So she was definitely alive at that time. So they interviewed another witness by the name of Ella McIntosh. And they asked her what her name was here and how old are you? Some of them didn't even know how old they were. So she said, I don't know. They didn't know. What is your post office address? Tallahassee. And they said she appeared to be 50 years of age. That's what they're saying. And it says, you are a citizen of the Creek Nation, are you? Yes, sir. How long have you lived in the Creek Nation? All my life. Do you know that man just stepped out of the room? Yes, sir. What is his name? There he is. He's right. His right name is Okey Drew. That is his right name, is it? Yes, sir. Did you ever know him by any other name? No, sir. He called himself Calvin Anderson. So it says that Okey Drew called himself Calvin Anderson, but everybody else was calling him Okey Drew. So that's how they got stuck on him. And then, of course, there's other witness testimony. A lady that by the name of Carolyn Renty, and it says, what is your age? I couldn't tell. I was born before the dark days. I don't even know what the dark days are. But some people say that I'm about 103. So that's pretty old, but it says she appears to look 70. So I don't know what her age was, but she didn't know either. What is your post office address? Muskogee. Where were you born? I was with these Indians before they started to come here, and way back in Georgia. So she started with them in Georgia and ended up in Oklahoma. And then it says, when I came to my senses to have an understanding, I was with them. And then it says, were you here in the Creek Nation before the war? Yes, sir. Were you here during the Civil War? I was here until the Indians got to fighting with one another, I guess. Was that during the Civil War? Yes, sir. And then it talks about which way did you go? I went south. The war was going on 2 years. Then the Indians split and we had to go south. Did you come before the war was over? No, I didn't come back till 7 or 8 years after. While the people I belonged to stayed, then we came. How long was the war over when you came back? The war was over 7 years and maybe a little more when I came back. You remember when the Negroes were free? You remember where the Negroes were free? Freed. Yes, sir, I was in Texas. So she was in Texas at the time. And it says, how long were they free before you came back to the Creek Nation? I don't think we stayed there more than 7 years as far as I can recollect. Do you know this old man that was in here? Okey, I raised him. I know his father. So she raised Okey Drew in Texas. And then it says, do you know that this is the same man? Yes, they called him Okey. They called him Calvin. Okey was just a nickname. She's already saying that.
What was that lady's name again?
Carolyn Renty. Carolyn Renty is the name.
Ever have a roll number or get in a roll?
Yes, she did. She did. And so it went on to say that she knew that Calvin's name was Calvin and that Okey was a nickname. Okey what? Okey what? And she said Calvin, and Calvin Drew is his name because Drew was the slave master's last name. Did you ever hear or ever know him to be called Calvin Anderson? I know his father. His father was named Anderson. We all lived on the same plantation. So she knew Okey's father. That's how Okey ended up staying with her. They trusted this lady raising their son while this war was going on. Was he a slave? Yes, sir. Do you know the name of his owner? I knew him well. His name was John Sales. Was Okey's owner, father's owner? What that meant is whether Okey's owner and his father was owned by the same slave master, and it says, who was Okey's owner? And she says Lila Drew, but she means Delilah Drew. Who was a citizen, she is a citizen of the Creek Nation? Yes, sir. Was Okey Drew in the Creek Nation at the close of the war? I wasn't here when he came. When they all left Texas, he left too. Was that the time you left? No, sir. Because remember, she left years later. Okey left before the lady Carolyn Renty. But Carolyn Renty did get her citizenship as a Creek freedman. But Okey did not. So, let me see. Where's my little pointer? Okay. Then you don't know what time Okey came back to the Creek Nation. No, sir. For that they all came before I did. Were you in the Creek Nation in 1866, 1867, at the time of the Dawes Roll? Dunn, D-U-N-N, Dunn's Roll. That was another roll that they had, the Dunn's Roll. I wasn't here at the time of the Dunn's Roll. You don't know whether Okey was here? I don't know. They came as quick as they heard of it, and Okey came. Okey Drew came. You don't know at your own knowledge? No, sir, I can't say, but he left Texas before I did. So she knows that he came way before she came back to Oklahoma. So that's her testimony. And then then Okey Drew himself. They talked to him. And they talked to him many times, but this is one time where they asked him, what is your name? He said, Okey Drew. Have you been known by any other name? Yes, sir. But they call me Okey. They call me Okey. That's not his name, but that's what they called him. You have given in your name other than Okey? Were you ever? But I made a mistake and didn't give the right one. He gave Okey Drew, but he said he made that mistake. How old are you? I can't tell exactly. So none of them knew what their ages were, which is interesting. And then it says, were you born before the Civil War? Yes, sir. How old were you when the war broke out? I don't really know. Old man Solomon would have, but he is dead. He told me how old I am, but I forgot. I'm close on to, I just don't know, I don't know. He said, do you remember the war between the North and the South? Yes, sir, I remember that. Were you here during the war in the Creek Nation? Shortly since after the war. What year did you come back here? I came back. Did you leave the country during the war and go south? I was there before the war. Were you there during the war? Yes, sir. How long after the war closed before you came back to the Creek Nation? About a year before I came back. Do you remember hearing of the Dawn Roll payment? Yes, sir. I remember, but I went back to my folks and I never stayed. I think that's what that is. Were you in the Creek Nation when the Dunn's Roll was being made? I was here, but I couldn't tell what they were doing. I never paid any attention to that. Do you remember when the blacks were freed? Yes, sir. Were you in the Creek Nation with them? No, sir. I was in Texas. How long before you came back to the Creek Nation? I don't know. I think it was 2 years before I came back. How old were you when the black people were free? I was almost 18, I reckon. Were you in the Creek Nation at the time? The Dunn Road. Did you leave before or after she did? I left before. She said he left before Carolyn Renty. And then he says that he's talking about here, I think, in the Creek Nation before he left Texas. He was saying that he was here beforehand, before he left Texas. Then he came back after the war, but he came back 1 or 2 years after, whereas Carolyn Renty came back 7 or 8 years later. So that's interesting. And then we talk about, according to some of the records here, that the Calvin Anderson appeared before the Commission of the 5 Civilized Tribes and made application for enrollment for himself in May 1st, 1901. A decision adverse to the applicant was rendered by the Commission, which says the decision was affirmed by the Department in December 11, 1901, and that under the date of December 22nd, 1905, the Department granted a motion to reopen file August 17, 1906, rescinding its decision of December 1st, 1901, and remanded said case for re-adjudication. Further proceedings were had January 20th and January 25th and January 31st of 1906. A copy of the transcript of the testimony taken in June 18, 1904 in the matter of the application for enrollment for Calvin Drew who so appears from the evidence as the same person as Calvin Anderson, is attached and made part of the record. The evidence shows that Calvin is also known under the name of Calvin Drew and Okey Drew, and he was born prior to the Civil War. The greater portion of his life has been a resident of the state of Texas, is what they're saying. And it does appear that the evidence of the records of the possession of this office, that the applicant under the names above mentioned is identified upon the roll of the Creek Freedmen made by J.W. Dunn prior to March 14, 1867, that he has never been enrolled as a citizen of the Creek Nation, or he has ever been admitted for citizenship in said nation by the Creek tribal authorities, the Commission of the 5 Civilized Tribes of the United States, Court in Indian Territory. So, you know, he was never accepted for citizenship, and it was primarily based on the various names that they mentioned and saying that his residency was questionable. But they knew that all of his other relatives were listed as Creek freedmen, and they knew these facts because they had testimony to support it from various witnesses. So the act of Congress approved on April 26, 1903, that provides the part as follows, that the approved roll of Creek freedmen shall include only those persons whose names appear on the roll prepared by the J.W. Dunn under authority of the United States prior to March 14, 1867, and their descendants born since said roll was made, and those lawfully admitted to the citizenship in the Creek Nation subsequent to this date of the preparation of said roll, and their descendants born since such admission, except such as, if any, has ever heretofore been enrolled, and their enrollment approved by the Secretary of the Interior. So there was a lot to do with the Dunn's roll. Before the Dawes roll, there was a Dunn's roll. So there was more of this going on with the confusion of enrollment too, in my opinion. And Okey Drew ultimately was once again denied his citizenship, and why, as most of his witnesses testified, in fact, were given their citizenship. That was interesting because Carolyn Renty was given her citizenship, and she was in Texas too. So how did they give her citizenship and didn't give Okey his? Okey came back sooner than she did. It says that he came back a year, even after a year later, after Okey Drew arrived in the Creek Nation. It's interesting that the commission made the decision to deny Okey Drew citizenship rights and didn't deny Carolyn Renty. And that's interesting. I still find that puzzling why that was. All of the witnesses that came forward for Okey were already citizens as Creek freedmen. But Okey, against his own will, he spent most of his life as a young boy in Jefferson, Texas. According to historical records, Jefferson was known for its manufacturing and supply port depot during the Civil War era. And I'm a curious person by nature, so I researched this place called Jefferson. It's listed as one of the most haunted towns in the United States today. I'm certain it wasn't always haunted when Okey Drew lived there as a kid, but one can only imagine the horrific events that happened during the Civil War. There are remnants of days gone by the existence of the Confederate Jefferson Ordnance magazine that was built in 1863 and is still standing as a brick structure originally used for transporting ammunition downriver to support the Confederate war efforts during the Civil War. This town is otherwise known for its antebellum homes and its creepy history. Some believe there are ghosts lurking in the shadows in Jefferson, Texas. No doubt this is due to the violence from the Civil War involving Confederate soldiers, which brings me to the conclusion that Okey Drew was stuck there for the time he spent in Jefferson, Texas. In his testimony, he repeatedly said he could not get back home. Once he was old enough, he returned home to the Creek Nation in Oklahoma, near Elk Creek, from all accounts. Many witnesses saw him there, and some even stated he was tending to the hogs of his former slave master, Delilah Drew. When you consider the timing of slavery and the Civil War and how many things happened, it's easy to understand that most slave families were displaced. The commission should have taken those factors into account. Even Carolyn Renty, whom Okey stayed with, came back to the Creek Nation after Okey did, and she was still granted her citizenship rights. This shows that the commission was biased and unfair and unjust in deciding against Okey Drew's citizenship rights in the Creek Nation. It is unbelievable to me that the commissioners were grilling this man about his time as a 10-year-old boy in Jefferson, Texas, when his mother and father were both listed on Creek Freedman Road. It certainly seems like history repeating itself, since we have been denied our citizenship rights for far too long due to the breach of the United States 1866 Treaty, Article 2, in the Creek Nation. I want to show you the slave masters that owned some of my ancestors. The first slave master here is the chief of the Creek Nation. He is William McIntosh. He's the one that was assassinated later. He was the first. No, he's actually the second owner, because he owned Nero. No, he owned Tarter Grayson and Melinda Grayson. But he got those slaves from this gentleman over here, Robert Grayson Gearson. He owned Melinda and Tarter Grayson first, and then he gave the slaves to William McIntosh as a payment, and then later they went back to his descendants that then sold them back to John Ross, who then gave them back to Delilah Drew. And Delilah Drew, of course, ended up having most of her father's. Chief William McIntosh was Delilah's father, Delilah McIntosh Drew. So she ended up with all of the slaves that he had, and I guess whatever slaves she had too. So all of my ancestors were mostly owned by Delilah McIntosh Drew. Now, these slave masters, they received lots of benefits from owning slaves, of course. And they didn't want to give up those benefits, obviously. And we're going to talk about some of those benefits, but these pictures are the pictures of slave owners that own slaves, and they own some of my ancestors as well. So I just wanted to give you guys a good look at that, so you know that you can place people with the events. Now, the Creek Nation, they had prosperous farms due to slave labor. According to Billie Jean McIntosh, who I read her book, she is a descendant of Delilah Drew. She wrote that the Creek Nation had prosperous farms due to slave labor. Even according to one of the descendants of Chief William McIntosh, who enslaved some of my ancestors, Billie Jean wrote that a man visiting the McIntosh plantation said that to Chief William McIntosh, "That's a fine herd of cattle as I've ever seen. William, you have fine land for cattle and farming. All your cowboys are hard working and better prepared than many I have seen working on the white farms. William smiled. So we're talking about William McIntosh. He smiles and he says, some are natives of my tribe and some are Negro slaves. But among Indian tribes, we treat them as family. My black slaves like working for me. So I said, Lord have mercy. What slave likes working for a master? Even Moses, part of the royal family of Egypt, fought against slavery centuries before Chief William McIntosh. It was wrong then and it's wrong now. Not to mention that the benefits slave masters received from slave labor were incredible. As you can see in the statement by the observer visiting the McIntosh plantation, that he owned fine land, cattle, and of course slaves. Yes, I said slaves because they value slaves as property too. And no coincidence that Creek freedmen were treated like property even after they were freed. Chief William McIntosh's daughter, Delilah Drew, benefited from slave labor since she owned many of my ancestors, hence the name Okey Drew. The Creek freedmen rolls consist of the former slaves, first names and last names of his slave master. This is how we connect who owned our ancestors, by simply checking the rolls. In the testimony of Okey Drew, witnesses mentioned Delilah Drew's place as the property he stayed and working on her farm. One witness said he was tending to her hogs at one point, so it was evident that daily farming was done by slaves. I know my grandmother, Rosalie Anderson, taught me everything I know about farming and gardening. She said her father taught her, and his father taught him, and so on. They were masters at using plants for medicine and cures, and this carries on from generation to generation. My grandmother taught me a lot about remedies for most ailments, and many of our family members still use these today. My ancestors' skills in farming benefited the McIntosh and Drew families. Another eyewitness account of the Creek Nation's wealth at the time was the former Senator Dawes. This is where the Dawes Commission came in. This is where the Dawes Act came in. It was from former Senator Dawes, noted that the Creek Nation had many wealthy tribal members who benefited from slavery. He describes the Creek Nation as the nation of mostly wealthy Indians. The former senator said to a group at a hearing with the Dawes Indian Commission and members of the House Committee on Indian Affairs that many of the Creek Indians are immensely wealthy. He was once a guest of one of them. He describes the member of the Creek Nation as owning Kentucky thoroughbreds and a great deal of land and property. He noted that the Creek Indian who was his host owned the U.S. courthouse, the government building, and even the house the judge lived in. Former Senator Dawes was in awe of the amount of wealth and was curious as to know how they felt about the colored people amongst them. So he asked, how did they feel about the colored people amongst them? The Creek Indian host said, the colored people are very good people. One of them is our supreme judge, a good, honest one too. I'm sure the judge he was referring to was Silas Jefferson, and that's out of the Indian Journal of 1894. This is more evidence that the post-Civil War era shows the Creek freedmen continued to make significant contributions to the Creek Nation, from farming to government and leadership roles. So what we're talking about when we talk about the treaty, I put a copy of it here for you, that Article 2. It says, and this was developed by the U.S. government in 1866 and the Creek Nation. The Creek-U.S. Treaty of 1866, Article 2 provides in pertinent part inasmuch as there are among the Creek member many persons of African descent. It is stipulated that hereafter these persons lawfully residing in said Creek country under the laws and usages, or who have been thus residing in said country, and may return within 1 year from the ratification of this treaty, and their descendants, and such others of the same race as may be permitted by the laws of said nation to settle within the limits of the jurisdiction of the Creek nation as citizens thereof, shall have and enjoy the rights and privileges of native citizens, including an equal interest in the soil and national funds, and the laws of said nation shall be equally binding upon and give equal protection to all such persons. This is the document where the breach is happening for Creek freedmen descendants, with the Creek constitutional amendment that was written that excommunicated them out of the Creek nation, and now it jeopardizes this treaty. You can't pick and choose parts of a treaty. The treaty is in whole and total, and that is why the Cherokee Freedmen in 2017 won the Cherokee Freedmen rights back into the Cherokee Nation with a dispute similar to the Creek Freedmen. And that dispute is on citizenship rights under the treaty with the Cherokee Nation. Each nation has its own treaty, but they all had similar language as it relates to freedmen. And the judge for the U.S. District Court said the treaty is the supreme document in which both the Creek Nation or Cherokee Nation have signed and agreed to accept freedmen as citizens, giving them equal protection and equal rights as citizens by blood. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the Creek Nation has repeatedly breached the agreement ever since the treaty agreement was signed. It has been 120 years of the denial of citizenship rights of Creek freedmen. I talk about starting with Okey Drew, and we're still fighting today. So my mother, her name was Onaise Helen Holmes before she changed it. She first applied for citizenship rights in the Creek Nation on or about November 25th, 1991, and she was denied based on a lack of proof of her degree of Indian blood. Even though her grandfather, Dick Anderson, was listed as a Creek freedman on the roll 2203, her great-grandfather, Nero Drew, was listed 2200. These were my mom's direct ancestors. And remember, Nero was Okey Drew's brother. Dick Anderson was Okey's nephew, my mom's grandfather. So Dick was my mom's grandfather. Yes, the situation is somewhat confusing because Okey Drew, a.k.a. Calvin Drew, a.k.a. Calvin Anderson, had so many different names. But again, Drew was the slave master's name, and they knew this. And Anderson was the chosen name from his dad, his father, Andrew, or Andy Sales. And many, though not all former slaves, dropped their slave master's name to create their own identity as freedmen. Former slaves detested any association of being owned as property, and many changed their names multiple times in life in an attempt to find true identity and acceptance as human beings in American society. My grandmother, my mom, my grandmother, and even I changed my name many years ago. My mom asked me when I was 13 years old if I wanted to change my name. I was eager and ready to drop what I thought was a representation of a world that I didn't fit in. I was the only one of my mom's children who completely changed their name. I still feel like it was the right decision, and I feel more complete with my identity now. With my identity now, I feel very complete, and the Creek Freedmen roll listed all my direct freedmen ancestors and their relatives except for Okey Drew. They lived and worked their entire lives in the Creek Nation with residencies of Tallahassee and Muskogee. And in Dick Anderson later, when he got older, Dick Anderson moved to Oklahoma City. He was still a Creek Freedman listed on the Dawes Roll, but he died as a Creek Freedman, and he died in Oklahoma City. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, I'm just going to briefly go over this because we have some more things to share. The Bureau of Indian Affairs is the oldest established United States Department of Interior, which is part of the Department of Interior. The Bureau of Indian Affairs sits under that, and it was established in 1824. It's responsible for administration and management of 55 million surface acres and 57 million acres of subsurface minerals, estates held in trust by the United States for American Indian, Indian tribes, and Alaska Natives. Their mission is to enhance the quality of life, to promote economic opportunity, and to carry out the responsibility to protect and improve the trust assets of American Indians and Indian tribes and Alaska Natives. There are 574 federally recognized American Indian tribes and Alaska Native villages in the United States. This document that I have here is from the current secretary, and she indicates that she approves a new constitution for the Cherokee Nation guaranteeing full citizenship rights for Cherokee freedmen. This is because the Cherokee freedmen won their lawsuit, and they, of course, accepted this, and they put this out as a press release from the Secretary of the Interior, Deb Hyland, and she approved the new constitution that was submitted for the Cherokee Nation. This is what would have to happen for the Creek Nation. They can do it without going to court. They can do it with just revising their constitution and accepting the 1866 treaty as the Cherokee Nation has done. The Cherokee Nation has recognized that they have breached that treaty. They lost in court, in U.S. District Court, and subsequently they did not appeal, and they accepted that as fact that they were in breach of the 1866 treaty. The Creek Nation is in breach of the 1866 treaty. They're still denying freedmen their citizenship rights, but we feel at this time that we are moving towards some correction. I say correction of this breach. I have made printouts for the Department of Interior. I'm going to show you. These printouts you can take with you. It talks about the freedmen, and it's dated in July of this year. It tells you that they are trying to find a way to figure out what to do with freedmen. So I'm going to summarize what this says, and you can take it with you and read it. But what it's basically saying is the Bureau of Indian Affairs feels that they have their hands tied because they're taking their information from the tribe on citizenship. But they also realize freedmen should have their benefits. But they don't know how to disperse that because Congress hasn't outlined that for them. How to do that without them being connected as citizens of the Creek Nation. So these are the questions that to really give you a better idea. When they drew up this 1866 treaty, Congress should have went back and revisited it to make sure they put in protections for the freedmen with other legislation. So there's a policy issue going on that's causing this breach to happen. So you have to put in something that says, if you do this, this is what's going to happen. There is nothing really stipulating that from the breach of the 1866 treaty. That's why it ended up in court in the first place. But now that court battle was won by the Cherokee freedmen, the Department of Interior has an obligation, and the U.S. government and the U.S. Congress have an obligation to go back and revisit that U.S. District Court ruling and come up with public policy to say, for all 5 civilized tribes, how do you manage freedmen and also stay in compliance with the treaty? You cannot do that with a constitutional amendment writing them out of their citizenship. So this is where the issue is today. So there was a commission, we talked about that, was established in 1893, and they got that name from Chairman Henry L. Dawes. He was a former U.S. Senator. And I put on here some background on the Dawes Commission. I won't go too much into that because we have more to talk about here. But the Dawes Commission, their mission was to divide up millions of acres of land in Oklahoma into allotments for each tribal member. Most Native Americans were against this redistribution of land. However, the 5 civilized tribes were forced to accept the agreement and give up their land to the U.S. government. These included the Creek, Cherokee, Seminole, Choctaw, and Chickasaw nations. The idea behind this redistribution of land was the United States would acquire the surplus of land. Of course, this reduced the amount of land that was going to be owned by Native Americans. But this was the master plan of the Dawes Commission. So that's where you get the tribal members by blood and Creek freedmen receiving 160 acres in the allotment. And you can find this information readily available on oklahomasenate.gov. And I talk about here, no more dreams deferred. So here are some of the ways we can change and move forward to a harmonious and inclusive Muskogee Creek Nation. For example, they need to discover descendants of freedmen. Some of the descendants of freedmen are sitting right in this room. It needs to be discovered. And when I say discovered, that's the reason why I wrote the book. So they can discover who we are. Because saying something and knowing who people are and putting faces to the history is a different thing. So people need to tell the stories so they can discover who descendants of freedmen are. We don't need to be silent. We definitely need to say who we are. And I think it's important for Native by blood to understand freedmen as well. That is what I talk about, harmonious. We need to know each other. I participate in many events that are Native. I know Native people in the Creek Nation, as well as lots and lots of freedmen, descendants too. And we need to read and know about our history and embrace it. So some of us have no knowledge of this history. We haven't embraced it because we don't even know. We first need to know who we are, where we came from. And then other people need to know who you are, where you came from. This is important, to embrace it, I'm not embarrassed by it. I embrace the fact that my ancestors were here. They were part of the Muskogee Creek Nation. We're still descendants and part of the Muskogee Creek Nation. I talk about this in the book. We're all Okey Drew. We're all experiencing the denial of citizenship rights. Now you can see how his denial of his citizenship rights is the same thing that I'm experiencing today. But we need to know that history so we can know how to explain what we have come from, where we come from, what we're experiencing today, and how we tie those things together. And that they can understand how we feel about our own heritage. And the United States government, U.S. Congress, Bureau of Indian Affairs, Department of Interior, Secretary, all need to listen to the U.S. District Court, because the U.S. District Court already ruled on this. This is already a ruling. It's ruled for the Cherokee freedmen, and the Cherokee Nation is a different nation from the Creek Nation, but it's the same legal question about denial of citizenship rights. So our Congress needs to get to work on policy, get to work on making sure that they be inclusive of freedmen. I'll tell you about inclusiveness. There's a Stigler Act amendment that was done in 1947, and that Stigler Act amendment was to protect native land, but our people's land did not get protected. And you know why? Because they weren't included in that Stigler Act amendment. The Stigler Act original, they wasn't included, and the Stigler Act amendment, what they did is, okay, so if you were native and you had a fourth of native in you, and you didn't have enough native blood under the original Stigler Act, you wasn't protected either. So on the amendment that they did in 2018, they said, we're going to take out the blood requirements. So you don't have to have blood requirements. You just have to be native and a citizen of the Creek Nation, and now you're going to be protected. You don't have to prove how much blood you have in you anymore. So if blood quantum is the blood quantum that they're using against freedmen to keep us out of the nation, they took it out of the Stigler Act Amendment in 2018. So if they took it out of the Stigler Act Amendment, how are they using it against us right now? This is the U.S. government now, not the Creek Nation. But the U.S. government is tied to the Creek Nation. And so the Stigler Act Amendment affects the Creek Nation and its members. And if they took the blood quantum requirement of degrees of blood out of the Stigler Act Amendment, there's no reason why we should be denied our citizenship right today. So that is why they need to listen to the U.S. District Court, look back at their amendments that they've done with Stigler Act Amendment, and revise the policies and public policy and legislation to protect freedmen for these treaty rights. This is how we can become more inclusive as a nation, to understand all of these aspects. They're very legal. There's a lot of legalities to this. We're talking two separate nations, United States government and the Creek Nation, but they do collaborate on many of these things. And that treaty binds the U.S. government. That treaty binds the descendants of Creek freedmen. That treaty is designed to bind the Muskogee Creek Nation to the articles in the treaty. So, when I say no more dreams deferred, many people are seeking to rewrite our history, but that's not the answer, nor will we be set free. Only the truth shall set us free from racial bias, inequalities, and injustices. Embracing the good, bad, and the ugly parts of American history is the only way forward toward reconciliation of race relations in the Creek Nation and in America in general. As I reflect on the part of the story that demonstrates the sale of slaves as property of the late Chief McIntosh and Delilah Drew, I recognize that selling human life for the benefits of free labor is wrong and inhumane. It strips away the structure of the family and causes displacement of family members like Okey Drew. Although America isn't a perfect union and never has been, most Americans understand that slavery was wrong. And one step toward ending these atrocities was freedom. One step was freedom. The Civil War determined the direction of the country, and and as a result led to the former slaves being freed. However, the question is, what's freedom without reconciliation of race relations? So what's freedom without reconciliation of race relations? Some former slaves didn't even know they were freed until later, and the celebration of their freedom came much later. The commission was aware of these facts in the case of Okey Drew. They still denied Okey Drew's citizenship rights in the Creek Nation. However, that never stopped him from pursuing his citizenship rights, though unfortunately all of his attempts were denied. I read a book by Daniel Chang, and he wrote in The Color of the Land, the 1866 Treaty of Peace between the federal government and the Creek Nation declared that freed slaves were full Creek citizens. In the eyes of Creek law, they were colored Creeks. Moreover, the treaty explicitly stated that black Creeks would enjoy an equal interest in the soil. Black Creeks would enjoy an equal interest in the soil. And that book was written by Daniel Chang, The Color of the Land. You can find that book available. It's very interesting. But this is very, very important. This is what ties us to the Creek Nation. And in conclusion, I want to say, of course, thank you for being here and listening about my relative, Okey Drew. As I said before, we're all Okey Drew. We're all experiencing, as Creek freedmen descendants, denial of our citizenship rights. And we are in the process of making the wrongs right. As many of us working on that and working on that behalf to correct this part of history that's also affecting the descendants of Creek freedmen today. And regardless of that, we're all still descendants of Creek freedmen. And we're all still tied to the Muskogee Creek Nation. It is within that 1866 U.S. Treaty, Article 2, always remember that. And I want to say, writing, of course, I have taken the path of legal, but writing, of course, is my first love. And I love to have the ability to express my passion and feelings and emotions, and it empowers me with inner strength and beauty. And to me, there's no greater blessing than to touch the heart and soul of another. And I really do think that this information and the book will enlighten you. This is just a portion of what's in the book. It's a lot more and a lot more documents. It's like over 200 documents. Those documents can tell you a lot more about the story that we talked about today. This book is dedicated to my mother and my grandmother. My mother's name was Zakia Abdul Rahim. She's also known as Onais Helen Holmes for her countless hours of research. This is where I get some of my information, because she took me where she went and she showed me the different things to look for, and we did this research together. Some of it I've done on my own, but a lot of it I did with my mom. And she had a fighting spirit to end all discrimination and denial of citizenship rights of Creek freedmen descendants. That was her goal. That was her passion to do. Also to my beloved grandmother, Medina Abdul Rahim, a.k.a. Rosalie Anderson, for her infinite wisdom and medicinal remedies that we still use today. My grandmother is at the top here. And this is my mom, and that's me. And to my great-grandfather, Dick Anderson, and my second great-grandfather, Nero Drew, for the roadmap to our heritage, the land, and family unity. And last but not least, I dedicate this book to the tenacity and the courage and honesty of Calvin Anderson, aka Okey Drew. May their stories live forever. And I want to thank you so much for coming out. Remember, we've left some material here in the front for you to trace your roots and information. We've got a worksheet. So you want to take that so you can try to document your family history. We have the program. We have books available if anybody wants a book. It's available near the bookstore, and I'll be signing those books shortly. Make sure you get some of the refreshments and stay and ask questions, and I'm going to open it up for questions and answers. So anybody that has questions and answers, this is the time. Okay.
Okay, I do have a question. So going back to the land allotments, was there a deadline established? So the two parts. So was there a deadline established for those who were allotted land? Because you stated that they were allotted 160, but they didn't have to take it all at the same time.
Right.
So if they didn't take it all by the time they passed, one, was there a deadline? And if they did not claim their allotment, what happened to what was
Okay. So the first question, yes, there was a deadline.
Okay.
But second question, I'm going to try to answer it so you can have a better understanding. So, like Nero Drew, he didn't take all his land at once, but he took it throughout the course, but he never lost his land. He just took different sections at different times, but they all had a time in which they had to claim their land allotments. And so applications for those land allotments, you could see the dated ones. It's definitely in the book of when they achieved those land. Now, I believe it was one time one of the descendants, one of our ancestors that are listed in the book, it's one document that says that she didn't want the particular land. Now, I don't know what happened to that land. So, but for the most part, I'm going to say for the most part, I'm going to say most of all the documents I've seen, most of those claim their land. Now, Ron, I don't know if you've ever seen anything different from that, but mostly that's what I've seen.
Thank you.
Yeah. Go ahead.
What happened to the land after, like, say Nero Drew passed away? Did it just go to his kids?
So his question is what happened to the land? That's interesting. I'll tell you what happened to Dick Anderson's land and Rachel's. This is much more interesting story. In 1974, Dick died in the late 1950s. Remember I said that. And his sister Rachel had died. They both had passed away. In 1974, someone came along and took their land by adverse possession. I have that document. The document is in the book. They came. They went to Wagner County. They said, we want this land, of course. These are deceased freedmen. They list their roll numbers. They list that they're freedmen. They know they're deceased. One of Dick Anderson's children, Alonzo, or they call him Lonnie Anderson, he tried to retrieve that land and he tried to pay whatever was due, but they told him it was too late. And they still took the land by adverse possession. So that land was taken. And that's why I told you that Stigler Act Amendment didn't protect freedmen. So it didn't protect their land. The Native Americans' land is supposed to be protected. The freedmen's land should have been protected too. These are the protections that I'm talking about that never were written in by the U.S. government to protect freedmen land rights, to protect freedmen's citizenship rights. This is what is at hand right now. So we still have to get this sorted out as well. So there's land that needs to be sorted out as well. because that land was taken by adverse possession, and why they had no protection for freedmen. Remember, I told you that Dick died a Creek freedman citizen. He was never disenrolled. He died that way. So why was his land taken? Why was Rachel's land taken? You know, this is the interesting thing. So these are the questions, are not so much questions, these are things I'm fighting for, to make sure that these things are corrected that were wrongfully done. So that's what happened to some of the land. Now, I don't have all the facts on all the land for every member of my ancestors, but I know this one because I have the actual document for it. So I imagine a lot of them, their land was just taken. That's what I think. So, any other questions or comments or anything from anyone else?
I would like to say it was a very interesting presentation, and I did enjoy it.
Oh, you got, thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Any other questions? It's a lot of information to take in. I'm telling you, it's a lot. It takes 40 years to accumulate some of this. I know Ron has been at this for 40 plus years, accumulating documents and information. There's still lots of information that we still are exploring. So it's just that everything is not in one place. You have to look here. Let me show you some of the resources. I've been to Fort Worth on a number of occasions. They have a national archive. You got to dig for information. And you got to stay there all day, days at a time to do this. Then, of course, you can find some information online. Now that they have the availability of things online, some of it is with Ancestry.com. You can find lots of information if you dig in the Department of Interior, the Bureau of Indian Affairs. You can find things at state universities, like I found the treaties for Oklahoma State University Digital Library. You can find things in old newspapers. So they have a thing called newspaper.com. It's kind of associated with Ancestry, and I belong to newspaper.com, and you can research old newspapers in that time frame. And one interesting thing that I did when I was researching old newspapers is I found a clipping that said that Dick Anderson got into an altercation. It says he was a freedman. He says he was a Creek freedman. So I'm assuming he was the Dick Anderson that was associated with us. And when he did get into this altercation, this gentleman and him had a dispute. The next day, the gentleman ended up dead. Well, they went looking for Dick, and the authorities wanted to get him before the mob got him. But the mob got there before the authorities. That's what the newspaper clipping said. And the mob shot Dick, one of the mob friends of the guy he shot him in the arm. And then, of course, he survived, obviously. But it was a dispute, and I guess they didn't have enough proof or evidence that he actually killed this gentleman. But it was interesting to read this. He was about, I'm going to say 20 years old, something like that. But this is the kind of information you can find in newspapers dated back in the 1800s, the time frame in which they would have been in the Muskogee area, Okmulgee area. You will find some of your own ancestors may have been in those headlines. For good or bad, they might have been in the headline. So you can find stuff that way. Some of the stuff that I found for Senator Dowles was in newspaper clippings because they covered him because he was a former congressman. So you're gonna find that he's in the news a lot. And what he said made the difference. It made a difference to how we are dealing with the Creek Freedman rolls today, knowing his insight on what was going on at that time. So I also found information by reading other books, like David Chang's book, and Billie Jean McIntosh's book. Her book is really written about Chief William McIntosh, and it's been published in 2019, so it's real recent. But Billie Jean McIntosh, she's probably near about 90 years old now, but she is a direct descendant of Delilah Drew and Chief William McIntosh. So these are sources and information that I've gotten, some of the information that I showed you today, but there's so much in terms of research and resources to pull from. And in the book, I have more resources that I have pulled from. I would also say that if you want to know more about the Muskogee Creek Nation and their citizenship application, it's online. You can take a look at that. You can also apply for citizenship. You will need birth and death certificates of your ancestors and yourself. You can apply, but you will be denied because of this constitutional amendment that is being challenged right now. And so this is really encouraged that people do apply, because in order to take someone to court, you have to be injured. The way you're injured is they denied you your right. And they never gave you that right, even though under the 1866 treaty, you're supposed to get the citizenship rights, right? So if you're being denied, you have a way to have a pathway to go to legal grounds and go to legal court. And that's what you want if you really want to be successful with what we're challenging, which is our citizenship rights today. I want Okey Drew to have his citizenship rights as well. So I'm not just fighting for my citizenship rights and descendants of freedmen, but also Okey Drew, my ancestor, who should have gotten his citizenship right 120 years ago. So I hope this information enlightens you guys. I hope it wasn't boring. I hope it gives you some insight on a pathway of understanding history and how it evolved and where we're moving forward. I think you see that we might look like we're in a roadblock, but we're actually making significant progress, more progress than we've ever made before on this issue. You can see it on the Department of Interior's website. The Bureau of Indian Affairs involved. They had a hearing in July on this matter with the U.S. Senate. We sent in testimony from July to August. Testimony was sent in support of freedmen. Lots and lots of testimony. And we're waiting for the Senate to reconvene, and they're going to make a decision on how they're going to handle the freedmen issue. Maxine Waters, who's a U.S. Congresswoman in California, I know her. She is holding some benefits for Native Americans on housing, up towards $2 billion worth, until they meet the compliance of this matter of freedmen. So we do have support with members of Congress. Diane Watson also supported freedmen when she was a member of Congress. There's lots of people, Barney Frank, lots of people who support freedmen in Congress, because they know what the treaty says. And they know that in order to support the treaty, their Congress, they wrote the treaty. They have to support the treaty. So they are supportive of freedmen and freedmen rights and citizenship rights. So we know that we're going to have a pathway soon to our citizenship rights. I'm very confident in that. I think Ron is very confident in that. And people that follow what's happening in the news will see that we're making significant progress. I even heard on a PBS program not too long ago that they were talking about Friedman, talking about this very subject. You know, so you hear it time and time again. It's getting more interesting to the news media and journalists all over that are interested in this issue of Friedman. So believe you me, I say by next year we'll make more significant progress, and maybe even the pathway of citizenship rights will open up for all of us. So thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. I hope you learned something today. And it's nice to see a lot of Friedman descendants here and everyone that supports Friedman rights. Thank you so much.
I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you for all of your research, all your dedication, your passion, the little bit of genealogy research that I've just done personally for myself, just for the excitement of connecting the dots, compares nothing to the work that you've done and you've put in to all of this, and I appreciate it. Also, it was one thing to be here and to see my family's name in your book. So I just want to share with everyone. Your grandfather is Dick Anderson.
Yes.
My great grandmother is Dolly Anderson, her grandfather's sister. And it had been asked of me when I first started doing genealogy, well, how did it come from Drew to Anderson? I didn't have the answer to that question.
Right.
I just knew possibly it had something to do with the slaveowner's name.
Right.
But I never knew that it was because those two brothers got together and said, hey, we're going to change this. We're going to start a new, legacy for our family. And
Right.
That's just awesome. Thank you for providing our family with that piece of puzzle.
Well, thank you so much, Linda, for coming. And you have all these people that are related to you right here in this room that you don't know yet, but they're here. And a lot of them are descendants from Dick Anderson. So Dolly was Dick's sister. And, let me, hold on. Okay, that's better, huh? I said you got many relatives right here, many descendants of Dick Anderson here. And there's descendants that I know of Lena Anderson and others that we've connected recently. And some live in Tulsa, some here in Oklahoma City. They're spread it out, but you have a pathway of meeting all of them too as well. So the next reunions you can be included, and then we have your number and your information. So that's what these things are for too, that's my aunt over here. She knows a lot more about everything. Her name is Geneva. And she knows, I think it's Sheila, isn't it? That's part of Dolly. She's also part of Dolly Anderson. And Sheila is another descendant of Dolly Anderson. I believe Sunboy was her father. Yep. So this is Sheila's. They're related to Sheila.
Sonny Boy, that's our grandfather.
Yeah, Sunboy. Yeah, Sunboy is Sheila's father. Yeah. So Dolly is her grandmother. Yeah. We'll have to when we get done, you can talk to my aunt and she can tell you about Sheila, because she lives right here in Oklahoma City. She was gonna come today, I think. I don't think she could make it, but. So, I'm just glad that we see family, descendants of Creek Freeman, we're connecting, and that's what it's all about. one of these days, you know, we'll have all of our family together again. I would really love to see Congress allow some funding for genealogy so that former descendants of slaves can research all of their ancestry so we can pull together all of our family. Because it's unusual that we're connecting on social media through Ancestry.com, but we have no real pathway to connect to everyone. And that's what I'd like to see, that they allow more funding that could give the resources to former descendants of slaves so we can put our families back together again. That would be wonderful. But thank you so much, Linda, for coming out, and thank everyone for coming out today. I really do appreciate it. And thanks to the Oklahoma Historical Society for opening its doors to allow Creek Freedman history today. Thank you so much.
Okay, I was born and raised in Okey, Oklahoma. I come here today to see the presentation of Ameenah Fuller, which she done an excellent job. I am a Creek Freedman descendant. My dad was Theodore Graham, roll number newborn 671 Creek Freedman. So even on my maternal side, her mother was Phyllis Johnson, and her roll number is Minor Freedman, Creek Freedman, 124. Today, as I stated, I've learned a lot today with Miss Fuller and her book that is out about Okey Drew, which is her ancestor. But today, I've just come to support her and what she has done. Myself, I am in the same predicament that she is in. We are fighting to become citizens of the Muskogee Creek Nation. I have done research for over 39 years, which my ancestors are, like I stated a moment ago, Creek Freedman descendants. So I can prove or connect with Indian blood, but it's not Indian blood. We're concerned mainly with the treaty, Article 2 of the 1866 treaty with the Muskogee Creek Nation in the United States. That treaty needs to be upheld. It has never been abrogated. So things need to change, just as the Cherokee freedmen or the Cherokee Nation has changed their constitution and their ways of doing things. But the Creek freedmen should be included because of the Treaty of 1866, Article 2. Thank you.
So my experience with the event, it was awesome. It was very informative. Just all of the research that Ms. Fuller has put into this was just, it could be a little bit overwhelming if you think about it, you know, because just on a basic research level as an amateur genealogist myself, I could not have put together the amount of information, just pulling it all together to be coherent. She did a great job. So what I found out today is my family's name, how it transitioned from Drew to Anderson, that Okey Drew and Nero Drew, and Nero Drew is my great-great-great-grandfather, so I think 3 great-grandfathers, that they decided to take their father's name as their own legal name to start a new legacy once they were freed. So that's new information that I learned. No, the best part overall is just connecting and knowing that I have more family. It was just an awesome you know, when your heart feels it's just so full of joy and full of tears, that has been basically, I would say like a goal, but goal may not be the best word to describe it. But connection is something that I said I've been seeking and wanting to have more connection to family, and not knowing that it would be extended family that I just didn't even know, you know, so that's awesome.